Awesome. So, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. There's a lot of content here, so I'm gonna get started. And if anyone has questions, feel free to either stop me or put your questions in the chat. Um, this is a very, very broad topic that covers a lot of areas that you could spend, whole semesters learning. So I might not have all the answers, but I will do my best. Alrighty. So I'm going to be going over these wildlife topics. In this presentation, I will be starting off a bit more specific and then working our way to a broader lens. They're all very broad because this is such a large area of study. But on the test, I only expect you guys to know some more of the basic ideas or like certain themes. So we have knowledge of wild birds, mammals, and herps. And if you're not familiar, herps refers to herpetofauna, and that would be your reptiles and amphibians. So here I would just have you tell me how you can identify them and maybe some common birds, mammals, and herps that you can find in Fairfax, which I expect you to use different field guides and different keys to determine the specific organisms. All right. All right. So the animal kingdom is separated into 9 taxonomic ranks. So it usually goes life, domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then species. This is like the true classification for animals. The first 2 are often omitted, and on occasion an extra one, like subfamily, is added. So on the right is a bob white quail, and on the left, you have its classification. You'll notice that the names are in Latin, and that's to keep the names universal so that there isn't any confusion with common names. So like how some people will say cougar and other people might call it a mountain lion, but they're both talking about the same species. So when we're talking about identifying, you'll want to rely on dichotomous keys and field guides for the most part. However, for more common species found in Fairfax, you should be able to identify a lot of them just on site. When we're working with mammals, we're looking at taxidermy, skins, pelts, skulls, and scat, which is poop, and tracks. For birds, we do have a larger amount of birds here in Fairfax than we do mammals. So these can be looking at their wing shape, flight patterns, their calls, and their silhouettes. For example, for the herpetofauna, we're predominantly looking at their body shape and head shape. There isn't too much herpetofauna diversity in this area of Virginia, but most people want to know whether a certain snake is venomous or, non-venomous. When looking at toads and frogs, you'd be listening for the different calls. So that's a good way to identify them. So when looking at venomous and non-venomous snakes, specifically in Virginia, you're going to be looking at their head shape, their scales, their eyes, and their snout. When looking at the snake's head shape, again, specifically in Virginia, not everywhere, you can see that venomous snakes have a more arrow-shaped head, and the non-venomous snakes have a more narrow triangular-shaped head. When looking at scales, you should check the vent and some caudal plates to see if it's a double row or a single row of scales. The double being non-venomous and the single row being venomous. So the vent on a snake would be basically its cloaca right after its main I guess its main anus. So when looking at their snout, you could see the heat sensing pits, and those are special organs that some vipers and pit vipers have, which help them detect prey and predators using infrared radiation. These pits are located on either side of the snake's face, between their nostril and their eye, and they're essentially small heat sensing holes that can detect temperature changes in their surroundings. And when a warm-blooded animal, like a mouse or a bird, is nearby, the heat sensing pits can detect the heat that is radiating from their body. The pits then send a signal to the snake's brain, which allows the snake to locate the prey and strike when it's even in the dark. And then the heat sensing pits are incredibly sensitive and can detect temperature changes as small as 0.00 degrees Celsius. So that makes for a very powerful tool for vipers and pit vipers. Let's see. There are 3 venomous snakes in Virginia. Those would be the copperheads, timber rattlesnakes, and cottonmouth snakes. The copperheads can be found all over Virginia. Timber rattlesnakes are mostly up in the mountains and the southeastern regions, and the cottonmouths are also found in the southeast. So if you're looking at these 2 snakes, you'll see that the one on top has a narrower triangular shaped head. So he's a non-venomous snake. When you take a look at the snakes at the bottom of their heads, a more arrow-shaped, they have a little bit more of an arrow-shaped head. So those 2 are venomous snakes. The top is a corn snake, and the bottom is a copperhead. If you look at their colors and patterns, you can also see that the copperheads have that signature bow tie pattern on them, along with the heat sensing pits on their heads, around their nose. I would be careful just when trying to ID a snake solely based on its color, though. There are many different morphs, and color patterns can get irregular, so it's best to not rely too heavily on the colors and patterns to ID them. But as with any kind of wildlife, you want to take as much information and data as possible to help you ID them correctly. So that's why dichotomous keys and field guides are super helpful, just in really locking in, what you're looking at, because a lot of the work has been done ahead of time to kind of isolate the different taxonomist variables of the animals that you're looking at. So in Virginia, there are 473 recorded bird species, and 90 of them are considered rare. 46 are waterfowl species, 9 are woodpeckers, 17 are hawks, and then there's a bunch of songbirds and generalists and migratory birds as well. I'm not going to ask you to ID all of them because that would be insane. But when you are identifying birds, body shape is going to be pretty key here, as well as flight pattern, the bird's song, and their plumage color, their feather colors. So you can notice the large diversity of body shapes here. So if you look at, where is he? At this nuthatch on the left, you can notice its shorter neck and kind of squat body with its one backward claw on each of its feet, which actually helps in identifying them because it helps them climb upside down on trees if needed, which is not something that a lot of other birds can do. So similarly, woodpeckers of different species have that pointed bill and unique posture, which is pretty consistent between the species, at least in this state. These animals would also have pretty identifiable songs that also aid in figuring out what kind of birds you're looking at. So when you hear a quack, you are going to expect to see a cardinal, right? For mammals, we don't have a ton of diversity here in Virginia, but we do have a decent amount that are easily identifiable. So using things like taxidermy is a good way to get familiar with different animals, but animal tracks can also be a useful tool for identifying wildlife in an ecosystem. The shape and size of the tracks can provide important clues about the animal that has left them behind, including their size, their gait, and their behavior. For example, tracks left behind by a larger predator like a bear will be obviously much larger than those left behind by a rodent or a mouse. Patterns of the tracks can also provide information about the animal's gait, such as whether it walks on 2 or 4 legs and how fast it was moving. It can also help you narrow down the type of animal you're looking at. So, like in canines, they don't have retractable claws like a feline might. So that would be visible when looking at their tracks. So you can kind of see here with the wolf tracks. Definitely take a look at some field guides and some common mammals here in Virginia. Let's see. I'm not really going to throw you guys anything crazy. I wouldn't have you identify the differences between, a wolf print and a domestic dog print. Those subtle differences can be pretty tricky to identify, but you should be able to identify like a bear from a raccoon, right? So skulls. I love skulls. I think skulls are very helpful when identifying different animals. You'd be looking at their teeth, eye sockets, nasal passages, and whether or not they have horns or antlers, and even the individual plates on their skulls. All of those things can tell us what it eats, when it's most active, how it sees and smells, whether it's a predator or prey, its age, and sometimes even its sex. So with the teeth, you'd be able to see if it's an omnivore, an herbivore, or a carnivore by looking at its canines and molars. Carnivores are going to have big, sharp canines, and herbivores are going to have generally flat teeth for grinding vegetation. And omnivores like us will kind of have a mix of both. So you can take a look at our canines to be able to, eat meat, and our molars allow us to kind of grind down any vegetation as well. The eye sockets can help us identify whether an animal is nocturnal because they will usually have larger eye sockets to allow for more light to enter their eyes at night. You can also tell if they're predators by looking at their eye sockets because they will be, at the front of their face and not, off to the side like many prey animals. So when you're looking at a mountain lion and many large cats, their eyes will be right in front of their face, whereas a deer's skull or a rabbit will have their eyes positioned on either side of their head to kind of help them watch out for predators. If the animal has a large nasal passage, it could mean that the animal is more driven by olfactory senses like smell. And obviously, body size, you're not going to have a large skull and a small body. So that's pretty straightforward there. Scat, or animal droppings, can be a very useful tool for identifying wildlife species in an ecosystem. The composition and shape of scat can provide valuable clues about the animal that left it behind, including their diet, their size, their behavior. For example, the scat of an omnivorous animal like a raccoon might contain bits of berries and seeds, while like a scat from a carnivore like a coyote might have bits of fur or bones. Obviously, the size and shape of the scat can also be used to estimate the size of the animal that left it behind. Scientists and researchers now can use a DNA analysis to identify the species of animal that left the scat behind. So that could be particularly useful in cases where it's difficult to observe or capture the animal directly. So scat can be used to track the movements and behaviors of animals over time, providing valuable information about their habitat use and activity patterns. For scat, I'm not going to have you guys do anything too crazy on the test, but you should be able to identify the difference between a predator scat and an herbivore scat. Okay. All right, so we are going into wildlife ecology now. We started off with a little more narrow of a lens, and now we're going to move to a broader topics as we go on. So here are some key terms we'll be talking about, but I believe this presentation will be given to you guys to study from as well, I think. Okay. So habitat, this is an area that an animal or plant lives in. It needs to have food, water, shelter, and space to survive. And in Fairfax, a good example of two different habitats would be, the red foxes versus the gray foxes habitat, where red foxes tend to have a wide variety of habitats that they can live in, whereas gray foxes need a bit more of a specific habitat in order to survive successfully. Cover and shelter is a pretty critical part of the habitat. This is pretty self-explanatory. This provides animals with protection from predators and from the elements and the weather. Water. So water is also very important. It can be obtained via free water, which is, just bodies of water, like puddles and ponds and lakes and stuff like that. It could be obtained from vegetation that animals eat or through metabolic water. So metabolic water is a type of water that is produced inside the bodies of animals through different metabolic processes. So when the animal eats its food, it gets turned into energy through a process called cellular respiration. And then during that process, the body produces water as a byproduct, and that helps the animal stay hydrated. So for example, desert animals, such as camels, rely heavily on metabolic water. So these animals have adapted to living in dry environments, and that just kind of helps them conserve water in places that are more dry. The range of an animal refers to the geographic area that it uses to meet its basic needs, like food, water, shelter, and reproduction. The size and shape of an animal's range can vary depending on factors such as its size, height, and behavior. Um, it's important when counting animal populations, especially for large mammals such as wolves, cougars, and other predators. Knowing the just knowing the home range of these animals is crucial when counting populations because if you don't know the area that an animal inhabits, you run the risk of either double counting or not counting certain individuals, and this can lead to like false conclusions about the size of a population, which can have some pretty serious implications for management decisions. For example, if a population is thought to be larger than it actually is, some managers might allow for hunting or other activities that can harm the population, which could threaten the species' survival. So, understanding an animal's range is important for effective population management and like conservation efforts. And one thing we have found is reduced home ranges in urbanized areas for animals like red fox and white-tailed deer. So again, with managing wildlife along with range, you'd have to consider breeding habits, migration habits, and where or when certain animal populations go into hibernation, or other wintering habits like many bugs that overwinter in their cocoons in the ground. So some examples of breeding habits would be like the painted turtle that usually occupies ponds and pond edges in Virginia, but when it goes to lay its eggs, it will look for more, inland, more terrestrial areas near ponds to lay their eggs. Um, as most of you probably know, many bird species have large migration patterns and flyaways, as you can see here on the side. Um, and these kinds of things vary significantly from organism to organism. Um, there are different factors that can stop a population of animals from getting any bigger. These factors can be divided into two main categories: abiotic factors and biotic factors. Abiotic factors are things in the environment that are not living, such as temperature, water, oxygen. Um, if these things are not at the right levels, it can make it difficult for animals to survive and reproduce. Severe weather events such as flooding or drought can also have a big impact on animal populations. Um, sorry. Biotic factors are things that are living and interact with animals, such as disease, predation, competition for food, and limited reproduction or access to females. So, for example, if there is a disease that affects a lot of animals in a population, it can reduce the number of animals that are able to reproduce and grow the population. So similarly, if there are too many predators or competition for food, it can make it harder for animals to survive and reproduce. These factors can all contribute to limiting the size of animal populations, and understanding them is important for managing and wildlife conservation. So here are some more key terms I expect you guys to know. Oftentimes, these words get used interchangeably when people talk about them, but they are different. So a community is a group of different species living in the same place at the same time. So those biotic factors that we talked about. Population is one species in an area, and an ecosystem is all of the abiotic and biotic factors in the area. So we have some pictures to show you about like what each of those terms might look like. So that's population, all one bird, one species of penguin. Community, we've got two animals right there, two different species right there, and how they're interacting with each other. And then an ecosystem, all those different, species, animals, along with, the mountain range and valley that they're in. So another important thing to talk about within a particular ecosystem, you might have a species that occupies a specific niche. And niches are different food sources, certain habitats, and even elevations. So a good example here is a pine tree with different birds. Some birds might be more suited to living on the outermost branches. Some larger birds like hawks and eagles would nest at the top, and some birds like woodpeckers would be in the inner parts of the tree, and some even on the ground like robins that usually look for bugs and worms in the dirt. When talking about niches, it's important to talk about whether a species is a generalist or a specialist. A generalist species is able to thrive in a wide range of habitats and use a variety of food sources. An example of a generalist species is the black bear, which has a very diverse diet, including meat, fish, berries, grasses, insects, honey, and even garbage at times. Generalist species are often adaptable and can tolerate change in their environment or the availability of resources. And then in contrast, a specialist species is one that's dependent on one or a few specific food sources or habitat types. So many endangered and rare species are specialists, which means they're more valuable to habitat destruction, more vulnerable to habitat destruction, excuse me, loss of their food sources or other disturbances. An example of a specialist species is the red cockaded woodpecker, which is a longleaf pine specialist. So this woodpecker relies on the mature longleaf pine forests for its habitat and nesting sites. So that would make it vulnerable to habitat loss. Specialist species may be endemic, meaning they're native to a specific defined geographic location. This makes them particularly vulnerable to changes in their habitat or their environment, as they may not be able to adapt to new conditions or find suitable alternative habitats to live in. Wildlife population dynamics. So this refers to changes in the size and composition of populations over time. So interactions with a population involve a single species, can be influenced by various factors, including birth, mortality, age structure, sex ratio, and mating systems. The birth rate of a species can influence population growth, while mortality can reduce the population size. The age structure of a population can help determine, the reproductive potential of a population, as younger individuals are often not yet able to reproduce, while older individuals may have lower reproductive rates. The sex ratio, or the percentage of males in a population, can also affect population dynamics, as some species have skewed sex ratios that can influence mating patterns and reproductive success. Mating systems can also play a crucial role in population dynamics, with monogamous species like Canadian geese having a single male and female pair bonding to produce an offspring. Polygamous species have multiple male mating with a single female, while I always get this word wrong. Polygyamorous species, like white-tailed deer, have multiple males and females mating with multiple partners. So with this, wildlife managers can develop effective strategies for managing and conserving wildlife populations. Part of population dynamic is often talking about the carrying capacity of a given species within a habitat. That's just talking about how many organisms, can an environment or habitat support. So factors that will determine carrying capacity include the amount of water available in the environment, geographical size of the environment, energy sources that are available, and so forth. The cultural carrying capacity is the maximum number of species that the human population can tolerate, and that's influenced by politics, NGOs, and the list could go on. So this is obviously very different from biological carrying capacity. Two of the main issues would be overabundant species. So that would be like our white-tailed deer. The habitat supports more than people can deal with, which ends up leading to people's gardens and landscaping getting eaten, or higher deer-caused car accidents. And then predators such as wolves or grizzly bears that pose a threat to humans and livestock. Although there may not be many individuals in the wild, the stigma and like fear associated with a species may also influence cultural carrying capacity. So both food webs and food chains are ways of showing how energy and nutrients are passed from one organism to another in an ecosystem. A food chain is a simple linear sequence that shows how energy and nutrients are transferred from one organism to another. It starts with a producer, which is usually a plant, and then it shows how the energy and nutrients are passed to a primary consumer, which is typically an herbivore, and then to a series of other consumers, such as secondary and tertiary consumers, which are usually carnivores that eat other animals. And then a food web, on the other hand, is a more complex and like interconnected network that shows the relationship between multiple food chains in an ecosystem. It contains many interconnected food chains that kind of overlap and interact with one another, creating a more complete picture of the relationship between different organisms in an ecosystem. So, in a food web, a single organism can be part of multiple food chains and interact with many other organisms in the ecosystem. For example, a bird may be a primary consumer that eats insects, but it may also be a secondary consumer that eats small rodents, which in turn, eats seeds and plants. So, in that way, a food web provides a more comprehensive and like realistic view of the flow of energy and nutrients throughout an ecosystem. So this is a pretty basic food web. However, it is missing decomposers, which would be, a network of bacteria, or fungus, insects, and worms and stuff like that, all breaking down dead organisms. So we talked a lot about different habitats and organisms. Let's talk about biodiversity. Biodiversity generally refers to the variety of all forms of life on Earth, from genes to ecosystems. Genetic diversity refers to the variety of genes within populations of a species, and generally, the more individuals there are, the greater the genetic variety, which is better for species to respond to changing environments and to avoid inbreeding problems. Species diversity refers to the diversity of species within a habitat and is typically the focus of biodiversity inventories, making it the easiest to study. Ecosystem diversity deals with the diversity of ecosystems in an area and focuses on the distribution of species and their interactions and community patterns. So this aspect of biodiversity is the least understood due to the complex nature of just ecosystem dynamics. And then understanding all three aspects of biodiversity is very important in managing and conserving the different ecosystems and, the diversity of life within all of them. When discussing habitat for wildlife, it's important to understand the concept of succession. So ecological succession is the process of how a community of living organisms changes, over time in a particular habitat. There are two types of ecological succession: primary succession and secondary succession. Primary succession happens in areas where no living organisms exist or have existed before, such as on a bare rock or sometimes sand. So over time, pioneer species such as lichen and moss and ferns will colonize these areas and start to break down the rock and sand and form soil. And as the soil develops, more complex plant species can take root, leading to the growth and diversity of a whole community of plants and animals. Secondary succession, on the other hand, is happens in areas where a previous community of organisms has been disrupted or destroyed in some cases by like fire, storms, or human activity. So in these cases, the process of succession starts with regrowth of existing species or the introduction of new species to that area. So disturbances are natural events like floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, and fires, or human actions such as prescribed fires, forestry activity, and disking or bush hogging that disrupt a change in the landscape. Um, these disturbances are important because they help maintain certain types of species, like those that live in early succession forests or grasslands. Um, these are areas that are in the early stages of development, and the species that live there depend on the disturbances to keep the area in this early stage. So, for example, young aspen stands, woodcocks, grouse, grasshopper sparrows, eastern meadowlarks, and meadow voles all thrive in these early successional areas. And without disturbances, these species might not be able to survive since they need the unique conditions found just in these areas to survive and reproduce. So while disturbances can be disruptive, and they're also, important for maintaining the health and diversity of an ecosystem. So this is an image of fire being used to maintain grasslands. You can see that. All right. So on to conservation and management. Virginia has a variety of habitats, including open water such as bays and rivers, agriculture fields that provide food, different types of forests like oak, hardwood, pine, mixed and riparian forests, wetlands like marshes, bogs, and swamps, early successional habitats with thick understories, um, grasslands, shrublands, meadows, and savannas, and obviously urban and suburban areas that typically favor generalists and invasive species. So each habitat supports a different community of plants and animals and may require human intervention to maintain their diversity and ecological health. Um, when managing a forest, it's important to consider what goals you have in mind. So if your focus is on canopy species, then the management strategy would be different from those aimed to understory species. So generally, pine plantations can be too thick with little understory for abundant wildlife, so it's better to selectively cut hardwoods to favor mass-producing trees instead. Pre-commercial thinning is also an effective way to promote herbaceous growth by allowing light to get to the understory. Prescribed fires can also be used to burn off the leaf litter layer and promote understory vegetation. Um, and aerial spraying can be used to kill unwanted vegetation that may be competing with other species in the forest. So these strategies help forest managers promote health and diversity in forest ecosystems, which is, beneficial for a wide range of plants and animal species. Wetlands are defined by their hydric soils, vegetation, and hydrology. Wetlands are often created or managed through changes to the water flow, and they're regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers. In wetland impoundments, the water level can be manipulated to improve seasonal habitat for ducks during migration, which can, involve planting and flooding crops. To manage unwanted vegetation, herbicide sprays can be used, while prescribed burning can also be used in some situations. But yeah. Early successional habitat management is important for maintaining habitats for nesting birds, like quails. Um, Native warm season grasses, like the little blue stem and Indian grass, are key components for this habitat. Early succession management often involves eliminating invasive grasses with herbicides. Um, and it's important to routinely maintain this habitat to prevent ecological succession. Management tools like prescribed burning and light disking can promote bare ground for forbs. It's creating and sustaining, a soft edge between forests and fields and meadows. So that's also important for providing nests and brood habitat for cover and, travel corridors for different species. So when we're talking about wildlife management in general, it's important to remember that, we're manipulating the wildlife populations, um, and the different habitats to achieve a specific goal, and that we're always looking to, the best available science to make those decisions. The science of wildlife management is continuously changing and evolving, and some techniques have been used for a long period of time. But as technology gets better, the way we do things changes. So instead of physically going out and mapping a field, we can use drones and satellite imagery to help us manage different populations a little bit more respectfully. When we're talking about managing wildlife, it's important to pick a key species of focus. And the more you know about the population size and how the species utilizes the habitat that they're in, the more you'll be able to help support that species. When speaking about who manages specific wildlife populations in the state or in the country, at the federal level, we have the Fish and Wildlife Service, and at the state level, we have the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, which has actually changed their name to the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. So change that. So they're going to be the ones managing wildlife from a policy level. They're also looking at the data and population dynamic studies and population analysis to help determine different courses of action. So here are some of the more specific agency roles. A lot of this is redundant to what I just said, but yeah. Bag limits. Bag limits are the maximum number of a certain species that a hunter is allowed to hunt in a given time period, typically, a day or a season. Bag limits are set based on a variety of factors, including compensatory morality, which is the approximate number of animals that would not have survived due to other factors such as disease or predators and human thresholds, which are determined by cultural attitudes towards hunting. And then population surveys and goals are also used to set bag limits, which wildlife managers estimating the size of the population and setting limits that allow for a sustainable harvest. Bag limits can also change from year to year based on population estimates and data gathered through studies such as MARC recapture studies, radio telemetry, aerial surveys, transects, and camera surveys. These studies provide information about population size, movement patterns, and other factors that can influence the setting of bag limits. Hunting regulations. So you have to have a hunting license in Virginia, and you got to pass mandatory educational courses. The courses are developed by the state of the different states and governments hunting wildlife agencies. Awesome. All right, so now we're on issues involving wildlife and society. We talked a little bit on this in almost every section previously, so you might just do a quick run through in this section. HIPPO, great acronym to remember. HIPPO relates to the 5 major threats to biodiversity. This is true in Fairfax, but is also true, around the world. So that's habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, or sometimes climate change, human overpopulation, and overharvesting, or overhunting, or stuff like that. So when we're talking about changes to habitat, we're usually looking at 3 things. Destruction is, the complete elimination of a habitat, like paving over a forested area. Degradation, which is like erosion or pollution or climate change, where it's slowly wearing down a habitat. And then fragmentation is splitting up a large block of habitat, which could be like splitting up a forest into different sections to make for highways and roads. So this is Lake Akatank in the 1960s. Yeah, this is it in the 1960s, and then that's it in 2017. But you guys were able to see all the different, development, and all of that development puts a lot of pressure on different wildlife populations. So both plants and animals can be accidentally or purposefully introduced to an area for cultural or ornamental purposes. So, for example, the European starling and autumn olive were intentionally introduced. These invasive species often have common characteristics like fast growth, rapid reproduction, um, usually are in the generalist habitats, and food types and high dispersal activities through, wings, wind, ribosomes, so they're able to um, get to a lot of places very fast, basically. So the issue with that are invasive species can outcompete native species for resources and space, often creating monocultures. They can reduce habitat diversity, food availability, and community structure while also increasing pressures on native species. So, um, since eradication of invasive species may not be possible, control is really the key. Um, Effective control strategies can help prevent the spread of invasive species and promote a healthier and more diverse ecosystem. So, some examples of that are like zebra mussels, which are invasive and are being spread to different bodies of water by people not cleaning their boats after taking them into a potentially affected body of water. So if you go boating or fishing, you might read signs that tell you to make sure your boat is clean before putting it in the water. So that would be an example of that. Wildlife can be affected by diseases caused by exposure to a range of microbes, parasites, toxins, and other harmful substances. In Virginia, several wildlife diseases have been identified that affect different species in different ways. For example, white nose syndrome in bats is a fungal disease um, that affects all the different bats in the area and has caused significant declines in their populations. Another example is chronic wasting disease, which is a neurological disease that affects deer and elk and has been found in some parts of Virginia. Um, and then finally, rhinovirus is a viral disease that affects amphibians, including frogs and salamanders, and can cause severe illness and death. And these diseases can have significant impacts on the population of affected species, and wildlife managers and researchers work to identify and manage those to minimize their effects on the populations and the larger ecosystems. So, spread of diseases within the deer herd are also a concern. I think I mentioned this one before. Diseases are transmitted more readily when deer densities are high. So, a key concern is the potential for spread of chronic wasting disease in free-ranging deer in Virginia. CWD is an infectious, neurological disease found in deer, elk, moose, and caribou throughout North America, and it's in the same family of disease as like mad cow disease, which can affect humans. It's 100% fatal to affected animals with no, known treatment or vaccine yet. And then this disease is caused by abnormal infectious proteins called, prions, which can be passed between deer through bodily fluids like saliva, feces, and urine. And studies suggest that it may be passed indirectly through water and like soil and food contaminated with prions. It was first identified in like captive deer in the late 60s in Colorado and in like wild deer in the 1980s. But yeah. And then endangered, threatened, and candidate species are classifications used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to designate the level of risk faced by a particular species. So endangered species are those that are in danger of becoming extinct throughout all or a significant portion of their range, while threatened species are those that are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. Candidate species are those that are being considered for endangered or threatened status, but don't have an official protections just yet. A critical habitat refers to specific geographic areas that are determined to be essential for the conservation and management of listed species. So these areas provide the physical and biological features necessary for the survival and recovery of the species. So designation of critical habitats is an important step in protecting and recovering endangered and threatened species. And then recovery plans are documents that outline the activities to be undertaken to recover a species that has been listed as endangered or threatened. These plans include detailed information about the species biology, threats and conservation needs, as well as specific actions to address those needs. So recovery plans are designed to help recover a species to a point where it's no longer required to have them under the Endangered Species Act. So on the test, I expect you guys to kind of, at least be familiar with these terms. So endangered species, extinction is when a species is no longer exists, period. And an extirpated species is the extinction of a species from a specific geographical area. So on the left, long-eared bats are endangered federally, and then on the right, the hair-lip sucker are completely extinct, so they no longer exist. Okay, so at-risk species. Endangered species share some common characteristics, including, being in a habitat or food specialist, endemic to a specific geographic area, or a lot of flightless birds, particularly in areas where predators have been, introduced onto their, smaller island, which was the case for, like dodo birds and puffins and things like that. Large, slow-moving animals are also at risk of being hunted by poachers and predators. Very long-lived species with low reproductive potential, particularly mammals like elephants, are also more vulnerable to those threats. Endangered species can also be valuable for food, pets, trophy hunting, furs, and market products like ivory, or maybe viewed as dangerous or a nuisance. And if they're at the top level of predators. Understanding these characteristics can help identify species at risk and develop effective strategies for conservation and management efforts. And I know that was a lot to go over, but I think, again, this is going to be shared with you guys, and it's being recorded, so you guys will hopefully be able to look back on it if you didn't catch everything.